Inside a small tent by the Veuler River, 6 warriors sit in silence, hidden in the shadows. The year is 922nd. A young woman steps into the tent. Her name is Cigret. She knows exactly what will happen next, for she has witnessed this ritual before, though never in this position. The Arab historian watching from behind the tent's fabric will never learn her name. He will only write that she was young, that she had once served the dead chief, and that she had volunteered to follow him into the afterlife. The third warrior finishes his task. The fourth moves in. Cigret speaks in broken Norse, a language she learned during her 2 years of captivity after her Slavic village was destroyed. "I see my master," she says. Though the words seem to drift into the air, directed at no one and everyone. He calls me to his hole. The fourth warrior doesn't care about her words. Neither does the fifth. By the time the sixth warrior finishes his task, Cigret no longer speaks of visions. The angel of death, a woman called to perform the final act, enters with a rope and a blade. One is for strangulation, the other is for certainty. Outside, the crowd grows louder, singing to cover any sounds that might escape the tent. In just a few minutes, Cigret will be burned on a funeral ship beside the chieftain she had served. She will become smoke and ashes, nothing more. But Cigret is among the lucky ones. She knows when her suffering will end. She can count the minutes until she is released. For most captured women, however, life was far worse. They were subjected to a system designed to make them wish for death, though it would never come. The Vikings did not create simple slavery, they devised a complex structure of female suffering so vast and intricate that it shocked even Arab historians, Byzantine chroniclers, and European monks. All of them recorded the unimaginable cruelty they witnessed, but the story of these women has been deliberately forgotten. Before we delve into the darkest corners of Norse society, if you enjoy learning about these hidden roots, hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Sister Aldred crouched deeper into the grain storage, the sound of Norse voices growing closer. It was June 8, 793, on the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of northern Brema. Just an hour ago, she had been copying manuscripts in the scriptorium. Now she crouched in darkness, grain dust filling her lungs, listening to noises she never imagined hearing within the walls of a monastery. Through the cracks in the wooden building, she watched the Vikings sorting their captives. Her friend Bridge was dragged by the hair toward the beach where strange ships awaited. Bridge had been beautiful, her auburn hair catching the sunlight during morning prayers. That beauty had become her curse. The Vikings separated the women into groups with the precision of farmers sorting livestock. Young and beautiful were put together in one group, older but strong women in another. The elderly and sick were quickly put to death, their bodies left where they fell. A hand suddenly plunged into the grain next to Aldred. Angus gripped her arm. A warrior with blue eyes and the smell of salt and blood yanked her out and shoved her toward the line of captives. Sister Aldred, who had devoted her life to Christ since the age of 14, would soon learn what the Vikings did to the women they captured. The journey to the ship redefined suffering. 40 women were packed into a space meant for only 20 if, for the first 2 days, there was no food, and they could only drink when waves splashed over the ship's sides, leaving them to lick the salt from the wood. The women were sorted by their perceived value. Even in the darkness below deck, the warriors knew exactly which women were selected for specific purposes. Held learned to recognize the different types of visits. Sometimes warriors came for violence, sometimes for other things. Sometimes they just came to look, to evaluate their share of the coming division. The journey from Lindisfarne to Norway lasted 11 days. By the 5th day, 2 women had died, and their bodies were thrown overboard without ceremony. By the 8th day, Held had stopped praying. God seemed far away in this wooden tomb drifting across the dark water. When they finally reached Norway, the division began immediately. The raid leader selected 6 women including Bridge. His warriors picked the others according to their reputation and valor shown in battle. Held was taken by a farmer named Gunnar, who needed workers for his fields. She watched as Bridge was led away to the chieftain's hall, wondering if her friend's fate would be better. She was wrong. 20 years later, Held would die in Norway, her hands worn down from decades of grinding grain, her back permanently bent from carrying impossible loads. She never learned what happened to Bridge, The rumors circulated within secret networks enslaved women built to share news. Bridge lasted only 3 months in the chieftain's hall before being sold to a trader heading east. After that, she vanished into the vast Viking slave networks that stretched from Iceland to Constantinople. The fall of Lindisfarne was not unique. It was a blueprint for 3 centuries of raids that would reshape northern Europe. Every monastery, every village, and every isolated farm could face the same fate. The ships could appear at any dawn, and when they did, the women knew their lives as human beings would be over. But Bridge was beautiful, and beauty in Viking captivity was a curse beyond imagining. The morning after a successful raid on a Frankish village, Chieftain Ragnar Ironhands slowly walked between rows of captured women. His men had arranged them by age and health. 200 women knelt in the mud of a temporary camp, their homes still smoking in the distance. Ragnar, holding a staff, used it to lift their chins and turn their faces toward the light, inspecting his new property. He sorted them into 3 groups with practiced efficiency. The first group, the laborers, included the older women and those showing signs of hard living. They would work the fields, grind grain, and maintain households until their bodies failed. The second group, the breeders, consisted of healthy young women of childbearing age. They would produce more slaves, their children inheriting their status. The third group, marked for special purposes, included the beautiful, the noble, and the very young. Marie, 30, a mother of 4, had seen her husband killed in their doorway by the Vikings. She went to the labor group. Her hands showed she could work, and her sturdy build suggested years of labor still lay ahead of her. She would spend the next 16 hours a day grinding grain in Ragnar's household, her hands gradually deforming from the repetitive motion until they looked like twisted roots. She would last 8 years before her body simply gave out. Isabel, 16, the daughter of a minor nobleman, was taken to the breeder group. Within a month, she would learn what that designation meant. Within a year, she would bear her first child, a boy who would never know his father's name. Over the next decade, she would give birth to 7 children, all born into slavery, all separated from her as soon as they were old enough to work. But the woman who caught Ragnar's attention was Margaret, 20, with beauty that transcended her circumstances. Her striking features stood out even through tears and mud. She was selected for special purposes. While Marie and Isabel would remain in Scandinavia, Margaret was cleaned, fed better food, and taught to speak basic phrases in multiple languages. Her fate diverged immediately from the others. Margaret was an investment. She would be prepared for sale in the great slave markets of the East. The selection process showed the economic precision behind Viking raids. This was not random violence but calculated harvesting. Each category of women had specific market values and intended purposes within the larger system of Norse slavery. The Vikings had industrialized human suffering with an efficiency that wouldn't be seen again until the Atlantic slave trade centuries later. Wagner's selections that day were replicated in countless raids each year. The Vikings had become experts at quickly assessing the worth of human property. They could determine a woman's age by examining her teeth, her ability to work by the condition of her hands, and her breeding potential by her hips. They even knew which enthesitis would bring in the most money in specific markets. Frankish women were highly valued in Ireland, while Irish women fetched higher prices in Iceland. Slavic women commanded top prices in Byzantine markets. The calculations were even more complex. A woman who could weave was worth 3 times as much as one who couldn't. A woman who could read and write, especially in Latin, might be sold to wealthy Byzantine households looking for educated servants. A woman with knowledge of herbs and healing could serve Viking households in a variety of roles. Every skill added value, extending the chances for survival. Yet survival itself wasn't always a blessing. Marie, once selected for the laborer group, soon discovered her fate. She was led to the grinding stones, 2 large circular stones used for grinding grain. One stone sat on top of the other, and a wooden handle required constant rotation. Grain would be poured in from above, and flour would fall out below. The woman who operated the handle existed solely to maintain this process. The woman who had been there before her had died after 7 years of grinding. Her heart had simply given out from the relentless work. Mary's hands bled within hours, but she kept turning the stones. This was her new life, and it would continue until her body failed, just like the woman before her. Isabella's fate, too, was sealed when she was brought to a separate building where other young women lived. They whispered to her about the grim reality. She was to be bred like livestock, and her children would be taken from her as soon as they were old enough to work. Resistance was not an option. It meant punishment that would stop just short of damaging her ability to bear children. The best she could do was accept her fate. For survival in this system was not just about staying alive. It was about adjusting to a new reality, where her identity and future were entirely determined by the men who owned her. Margaret's journey, however, took a different turn. As part of the Special Purposes group, she was treated differently from the others. She was bathed, given better food, and taught to speak multiple languages, including Arabic, Greek, and Slavic. She learned to walk in a way that showcased her beauty, making her more appealing to potential buyers in the Eastern slave markets. She was prepared to be sold to the highest bidder. This meticulous preparation revealed just how systematically the Vikings operated. Their economy relied on the careful management and trade of human beings. Women were not just captured in raids, they were selected, trained, and groomed for specific roles in a system that turned their bodies into commodities. Margaret, like others in her group, was seen not as a person, but as an investment. The Vikings knew which traits would increase her value: beauty, youth, and the potential for producing more slaves. She was an asset, and like any other asset, her worth was carefully calculated. In Viking society, the treatment of women and their roles as property became ingrained in the social structure. The wealth generated from raids and slave trading funded Viking expeditions and settlements. The chieftains who ruled over these women used their bodies as both symbols of conquest and tools of economic gain. The women themselves were stripped of their identities, their lives reduced to numbers and labels, their fates decided by the whims of those who owned them. For many women, this life was not just one of physical toil, but of emotional and psychological degradation. As a woman in Viking captivity, there were few, if any, moments of reprieve. And for those who were captured at a young age like Astrid, the cycle of slavery could stretch across generations. Astrid was just 7 years old when she learned that she was property. She had tried to play with the blacksmith's daughter when the girl spat out words Astrid didn't understand. Th or L brat. Her mother found her crying behind the grain storage and explained what no child should ever have to know: they were not people. They were things that looked like people but had no rights. Astrid's mother, Ingrid, had been taken when she was just 15 years old. Captured by the Vikings, she had been forced into breeding and labor, bearing multiple children who would also inherit her status as a thrall, a slave. Ingrid's body had been used and abused, and her children were born into the same fate. Astrid, too, would eventually become a part of the system. In the Viking system, there was no hope of escape for women like Astrid. Her life was predetermined, her future defined by the ownership of men who saw her as nothing more than a tool for labor and reproduction. As each generation of women was born into slavery, the psychological toll of captivity intensified. It was just that these women were physically bound by chains; their very identities were shackled by a society that denied them the most basic of human rights. Ingrid, who had known freedom in Ireland, held on to memories of her past, teaching her children a language they would never use. She represented a distant connection to a time before captivity. But for her children, those memories were little more than fairy tales. The cycle of slavery was unbreakable, and each new generation found themselves further entrenched in the system. The devastating truth of Viking slavery is that it wasn't simply about physical control. It was about controlling human potential, erasing identities, and ensuring that each woman's worth was measured only by her labor and reproductive abilities. The Vikings built an empire on the backs of enslaved women, and while their exploits as warriors and explorers are celebrated, the true cost of their achievements is often forgotten. But even in the face of such overwhelming oppression, some women found ways to resist. Whether through small acts of defiance or outright rebellion, they found ways to fight back. Some poisoned their masters, others engaged in slow acts of sabotage. There were even instances of women escaping captivity, though most who tried were recaptured or died trying. But their resistance, no matter how small, became part of the broader story of Viking slavery, a story that has been largely ignored by mainstream history. Resistance was not just a matter of physical escape. For many women, it was a form of survival that existed in the small acts of defiance they could muster within the confines of their circumstances. By most were punished or killed for their efforts. Their actions created ripples that disturbed the system, even if only briefly. One of the most effective forms of resistance was poisoning. Women who worked in kitchens or brewing rooms had access to various herbs and substances that could bring harm to their captors without being immediately detected. Some learned to mix substances that caused slow illnesses, while others, like Deirdre, chose more direct methods. Deirdre had been captured when the Vikings raided her family's farm near Cork. She had seen them kill her husband and eldest son, and her younger children were scattered across different settlements. Deirdre had been brought to the Viking chieftain Hakon's hall as a brewing specialist. Her knowledge of herbs and fermentation made her invaluable for producing mead. Over the course of several months, she collected mushrooms from Norwegian forests. These mushrooms were highly toxic, and Deirdre knew exactly how to prepare them for a deadly feast. She waited for a celebration when the warriors would drink heavily, and when the time came, she added the poison mushrooms to the mead. By the time the Vikings discovered what had happened, Deirdre's revenge had been carried out. 12 of Hakon's warriors were dead, their faces frozen in agony, their bodies contorted in the final stages of poison-induced death. When they found her, Deirdre stood among the corpses offering no resistance. She was eventually captured, but she didn't scream or beg for mercy. Instead, she calmly asked if all 12 men were dead. When told that they were, she smiled, the smile that haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. Deirdre's defiance was unique, but her success was. Most acts of resistance ended in death, and sometimes even death didn't bring the release these women sought. Viking law and custom ensured that even widows remained slaves, passing from their dead husbands to their brothers or sons, further cementing the control the system had over their lives. The Vikings created a network of subjugation so thorough that it was nearly impossible for women to escape its grasp. While some women fought back with acts of sabotage, others took a more passive form of resistance. One particularly heartbreaking act of defiance was infanticide. Many enslaved women, understanding the fate their children would inherit, chose to end their lives before condemning their children to a lifetime of slavery. Some smothered their infants in their sleep, others abandoned them in the wild, choosing grief over the possibility of watching their children suffer the same fate they had. Norsemythology viewed this as property destruction, not as a desperate act of mercy. For these women, the hope of freedom was a distant dream, an impossible idea that existed only in the realm of memory and fantasy. They were wrapped in a system that denied them any agency, and for many, death was the only form of freedom left. Other women resisted in more subtle ways, through cultural preservation. They taught their children the language and traditions of their homelands, passing down stories and customs from before their capture. This was an act of survival. These women understood that, while they could not escape their physical captivity, they could preserve their identities and the legacies of their ancestors. They passed down songs, stories, and genealogies, ensuring that their heritage would survive even if they themselves were lost to history. In Iceland, women who had been captured in earlier raids continued this tradition, teaching their children to speak in secret, hidden languages. They would whisper the stories of their people, teaching their children the ways of their ancestors, even though their captors would never understand. This cultural resistance was an act of defiance, a way to hold onto a piece of themselves that the Vikings sought to erase. But for many, the only form of resistance available was survival. They adapted to the brutal conditions of slavery, learning to endure whatever was thrown at them. They developed strategies for avoiding punishment, for securing small comforts, and for protecting themselves and their children. But this survival came at a heavy price, one that would be paid for generations to come. The children of these enslaved women were born into the same system, inheriting their mother's status as thralls. This inheritance of slavery created a cycle that would continue for centuries. These children would grow up knowing no other life than captivity. They would learn the same survival strategies, passing them down to their own children in turn. For the Viking society, the systematic enslavement of women was a key part of their expansion and success. The wealth generated from the slave trade fueled their conquests, allowing them to fund expeditions, raids, and settlements. But this wealth came at an incredible human cost. The Vikings were often celebrated for their raids and their role in shaping European history, built their empire on the backs of the women they enslaved. This fact is largely absent from the popular narratives of Viking history. Museums and tourist attractions celebrate Viking strength, exploration, and warfare, but rarely mention the hundreds of thousands of women who were enslaved and subjected to unimaginable cruelty. The sagas that have preserved the stories of Viking heroes barely acknowledge these women, and when they do, they appear as little more than background figure servants who are present only to serve the men around them. The story of Viking slavery is not just one of physical subjugation, it is also a story of erasure. The names of these women were deliberately forgotten, their suffering systematically erased from the historical record. Yet, the impact of their suffering is still felt today. Modern DNA studies show that, while the male lineage of Northern Europe is predominantly Norse, the female lineage is heavily Celtic, particularly Irish and Scottish. This evidence reveals the true scale of the Viking slave trade, showing how the genetic makeup of entire populations was altered by the systematic abduction and forced reproduction of women. But even in the face of such overwhelming oppression, these women resisted, whether through small acts of sabotage, acts of defiance like poisoning, or the preservation of their culture. They fought back against the system that sought to strip them of their humanity. They may not have been able to escape their captivity, but their resistance, however small, left an indelible mark on the Viking world. Despite their suffering, the enslaved women in Viking society weren't completely powerless. While most of their acts of resistance were small and often lead to their deaths, some of them did manage to break the chains of their captors, even if just for a brief moment. One particularly noteworthy example of defiance was a group of Irish women who, after years of enduring brutality, orchestrated a coordinated rebellion. They were working on various Viking farms in Iceland, performing the backbreaking labor required to keep the settlements functioning. But over time, these women developed a plan. They would slowly poison their masters with small doses of a local herb, one that caused a slow but debilitating illness. The plan was to weaken the Viking settlers enough so that they could take control. It took 2 years for the plan to come to fruition, and when it did, it ended in tragedy. The women were caught, and all 15 of them were burned alive in a single execution, a brutal punishment meant to serve as a warning to any others who might consider rebellion. The women's rebellion may have failed, but their actions spoke volumes. It demonstrated that even in the harshest of circumstances, there were those who would not quietly accept their fate. They found ways to resist, even if it meant sacrificing their own lives. In their final act, they showed the world that, even in captivity, their spirits couldn't be fully broken. Their resistance was just physical. For some, it was intellectual and cultural. One of the most subtle forms of resistance was preserving their ancestral knowledge. Enslaved women would pass down languages, songs, and traditions from their homelands, ensuring that the memory of their people survived even if they were lost to history. These small acts of defiance allowed them to hold on to their identities in a world that sought to erase them. In the Viking world, women's bodies were not only commodities but tools for maintaining social order. The wealth generated from slave trading allowed Viking chieftains to fund their raids and expeditions, and the reproductive labor of enslaved women ensured that there would always be more slaves to capture and trade. The Vikings were able to expand their empire through calculated violence and the systematic exploitation of women. This economic structure was built on the idea that women were not people, but property. They were commodities to be used, traded, and sold for profit. Their suffering was not only accepted, it was expected. In a society that depended on slavery to thrive, the exploitation of women was central to its functioning. Yet, their stories have been largely forgotten, erased from the historical record by the very system that enslaved them. Viking sagas and chronicles focus on the warriors and explorers, the men who shaped the course of history. But the women who enabled their conquests, who lived and died as slaves, are barely mentioned. When they are, it's often as an afterthought, their identities reduced to mere background details. These women were not heroes, they were victims. Their suffering used to fuel the expansion of a brutal empire. But these women weren't just victims. They were survivors. They fought, they resisted, and they did what they could to hold on to their humanity. And while their stories were erased from the official record, the legacy of their suffering and resilience lives on in the very DNA of the modern world. Genetic studies have revealed that the women who were enslaved by the Vikings left their mark on history in ways that go beyond physical labor. The genetic makeup of modern Northern Europeans bears traces of the women who were abducted from Ireland, Scotland, and other parts of Europe and brought to the Viking settlements. These women were the foundation of Viking society, yet their contributions have been largely forgotten. Their stories, erased from the written record, live on in the bodies of the descendants of those who profited from their suffering. The story of Viking slavery is one that continues to shape our understanding of history. It shows us how the foundations of empires are often built on the exploitation of vulnerable populations, and how the suffering of women has been systematically erased from the historical narrative. But by remembering their stories, by acknowledging their suffering, we begin to understand the true cost of Viking expansion and the role these women played in building the world that we know today. As we look back on history, we must remember that the achievements of societies are often built on the backs of those who were silenced, depressed, and forgotten. The Viking Age is no exception. The ships that sailed from Scandinavia to distant lands were not only filled with warriors and treasure, they also carried the bodies of enslaved women who were the true foundation of Viking success. These women were not just property, they were mothers, daughters, and sisters, each with their own stories and dreams, erased from history by the very society that depended on their labor. But as we uncover these hidden stories, we can begin to honor their memory and recognize the price that was paid for Viking expansion. While the Vikings may have left behind a legacy of exploration and conquest, the legacy of the women they enslaved is just as important. It is a story of resilience, of survival, and of defiance in the face of unimaginable brutality. The women who endured the horrors of Viking slavery may never be remembered in the same ways who conquered the known world, but their lives and their suffering are just as integral to our understanding of the past. While the stories of these women have been largely forgotten, their legacy is not entirely lost. Every time we uncover a new piece of history, whether through DNA studies, archaeological digs, or the forgotten records that resurface in archives, we shed light on the experiences of those who were erased from the official narrative. These women were not mere background figures, they were essential to the Viking world, and their lives, though oft unmarked by cruelty and suffering, left an indelible mark on history. Modern studies have revealed that the genetic makeup of many people living in Northern Europe today carries the traces of those enslaved women. In Iceland, for example, genetic research has shown that while the male lineage is overwhelmingly Norse, the female lineage is largely Celtic, with a significant number of women's ancestors coming from Ireland and Scotland. This genetic evidence directly correlates to the widespread abduction of women by the Vikings during their raids. The Viking expansion, therefore, was not just a conquest of land, it was a massive, systematic act of human trafficking that permanently altered the demographic makeup of large parts of Europe. But even though these women's names were forgotten, their bodies became part of the landscape. The very bloodlines of many modern Europeans bear the mark of Viking raids. Their story is written in the DNA that courses through the veins of millions of people today. These women are the hidden ancestors of many, their legacy preserved not in books or monuments, but in the genetic material that lives on in the present. In the Viking world, the brutal practices that sustained their empire were not seen as unusual or exceptional, they were standard. The slavery of women was so deeply integrated into their society that it was normalized. The system was not only about physical subjugation, but also about maintaining a structure where women's bodies were commodities. Their suffering was not merely tolerated, it was woven into the very fabric of Viking society, providing the labor and resources that allowed their civilization to thrive. Yet, the women themselves resisted. They found ways to fight back, even if it meant sacrificing their own lives. Through poisoning, sabotage, and even suicide, they demonstrated that even in the most hopeless situations, their spirit could not be fully extinguished. They may not have been able to escape, but they fought for their dignity, and in doing so, they left a legacy of resistance that continues to inspire. Though their lives were unmarked by violence and cruelty, the enslaved women of the Viking Age were not just victims. They were women who loved, who dreamed, who resisted, and who, even in death, managed to assert their humanity. They may not have had control over their fates, but they found ways to assert control over what little they could. Their stories, though rarely told, are an integral part of the Viking legacy, one that has been overshadowed by the tales of warriors and kings. The Viking conquests that we celebrate today through books, movies, and tourist attractions are oft unpainted with a romanticized brush. We admire their exploration, their raids, their warriors who sailed across the seas, conquering lands and building empires. Yet, we rarely acknowledge the cost of this expansion. The wealth and power that fueled Viking society came from the systematic exploitation of women. The Vikings were not just warriors and explorers. there were also human traffickers, who built their empire on the bodies of enslaved women. In many ways, the Viking raids were not just about conquest, they were about control. The Vikings didn't just want land and treasure, they wanted the labor and reproduction of women. They understood that to truly expand their empire, they needed more than warriors. They needed slaves, particularly women, who could bear children and produce labor. This understanding was central to the Viking economy, and it is a truth that modern history often overlooks. But the history of Viking slavery is not only a history of violence and exploitation. It is also a history of survival and resilience. The women who were captured and enslaved by the Vikings were often forced into unimaginable circumstances, yet they found ways to survive, resist, and preserve their identity. They passed down stories, languages, and traditions from their homelands, ensuring that their cultures would not be completely erased. They may have been silenced, but their legacy lives on in the descendants of those who were stolen from their homes. Their stories are not just a reminder of Viking cruelty, they are a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Despite everything, these women managed to hold on to their dignity, their identities, and their sense of self. They resisted in whatever way they could. And through their resistance, they became part of the larger story of Viking history. The wealth that funded Viking expeditions, the treasures they accumulated, and the lands they conquered were all built on the backs of enslaved women. Their bodies were used to create the empire that Vikings are known for today. But their stories, their suffering, and their resistance have largely been forgotten. It is time to remember them not as nameless victims, but as individuals who played an essential role in shaping the world as we know it. The women who were enslaved by the Vikings were not just property, they were human beings, each with their own name, their own story, and their own legacy. It is time to give them the recognition they deserve. As we study the Viking era, it is important to acknowledge the full scope of their impact, not just as warriors, but as traffickers of human lives. The Vikings may have built an empire, but it was an empire founded on the suffering of countless women, whose names were erased from history. Their story is one that we must remember, for it is an essential part of the Viking legacy, a legacy that cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the women who suffered to make it possible. The Viking expansion, though often glorified, was built on a deeply disturbing foundation. The raids that brought wealth, power, and territory to Viking chieftains were, in large part, funded by the trafficking and exploitation of women. The women captured in these raids were not just used as slaves, they were commodities, traded and sold across vast distances, from Scandinavia to Byzantium, from Ireland to Constantinople. Their bodies were not theirs, they belonged to the men who captured them, to the traders who bought and sold them, to the society that benefited from their labor and reproduction. While the Vikings are celebrated for their seafaring skills, their raids, and their warrior culture, we must also recognize that much of their success was due to the systematic abuse of women. The vast slave trade that underpinned Viking society was essential to their conquests. The women they captured were used for labor, reproduction, and even as a form of status symbol. The chieftains and warriors who raided the coasts of Europe understood that, to truly build an empire, they needed more than just land and treasure. They needed a constant supply of human labor. Women were their supply. The process of capturing and enslaving women was highly organized. The Vikings would raid villages and monasteries, separating the women into categories based on their age, beauty, and usefulness. The youngest and most beautiful were often selected for the special purposes group, where their value was based on their ability to produce more slaves through childbirth or to be sold in the eastern slave markets. The older women, those with experience in household labor, were sent to the labor group, where they would work on farms, in kitchens, or as domestic servants. The elderly and sick were discarded, their lives considered expendable. The women who were lucky enough to survive the journey from the raid to their new owners' lands often faced a life of grueling labor. They were worked to the bone, their bodies pushed beyond their limits, all in the service of their masters. For those in the breeding group, their value was measured by their ability to bear children. These children, born into slavery, would inherit their mother's status and continue the cycle of exploitation. The fate of these women was grim, and for many, it was a life sentence. They could not escape. They had no rights. They were property, plain and simple. Their suffering was not a byproduct of Viking raids, it was the very engine that drove their society forward. The wealth that flowed into Viking chieftains' coffers was built on the backs of enslaved women, who were used as tools to create more wealth, more slaves, and more conquests. Yet, even within this brutal system, there were elements of resistance. Some women, unable to escape physically, found other ways to fight back. Through small acts of sabotage, such as poisoning their captors or causing disruptions in their work, they found ways to assert control over their lives. Others, like Deirdre, who poisoned 12 Viking warriors in revenge for the death of her family, managed to strike back in spectacular wins. Though at the cost of their own lives, these acts of defiance may not have changed the system, but they showed that, even in the most oppressive conditions, there was still a flicker of resistance. The tragedy of Viking slavery is not just in the brutality of the system, but in the erasure of these women from history. The men who fought in Viking raids were celebrated in sagas and songs, their names immortalized in the annals of history, but the women who were captured, enslaved, and exploited are barely mentioned. They are mere footnotes in the grand story of Viking conquests, their suffering ignored or glossed over. The silence around their experiences is deafening. It is essential to recognize the role that these women played in Viking society, not just as victims, but as survivors. They were integral to the functioning of the Viking world. Their bodies used to create the wealth and power that allowed the Vikings to thrive. And yet, their stories have been lost to time. The very infrastructure that supported Viking expansion was built on their suffering, but their voices were silenced, their experiences erased from the history books. Today we have a chance to rewrite that history, to give these women the recognition they deserve. We can no longer ignore their suffering or dismiss their importance. The Vikings were not just warriors and explorers, they were human traffickers, and the women they enslaved were the backbone of their empire. It is time to acknowledge the hidden history of Viking slavery and to remember the women whose lives were stolen, whose bodies were used to fuel an empire built on their suffering. These women were not just property, they were human beings with names, with stories, and with the right to be remembered. Their story is not one of passive victimhood. It is a story of survival, resistance, and resilience. The women who endured Viking slavery may never be fully acknowledged, but their legacy lives on in the descendants of those who were stolen from their homes, in the genetic traces they left behind, and in the resistance they demonstrated, however small, against a system designed to break them. By remembering these women, we honor their memory. We recognize the cost of Viking expansion and the brutal system that sustained it. We acknowledge that the Vikings were not just conquerors, they were replicas of human lives, and their empire was built on the suffering of countless women. These women, whose names have been lost to history, deserve more than to be forgotten. They deserve to be remembered, not as property, but as people who lived, who loved, who fought, and who survived. As we look back on Viking history, it's crucial to recognize the unspoken truths that have been buried beneath the glorified tales of warriors and explorers. While the Vikings are often celebrated for their seafaring feats and military prowess, the reality of their conquests involved immense suffering, particularly for the women they captured. These women were not just victims, they were essential to the economic and social structure of Viking society, but their contributions were largely ignored. Viking raids may have been driven by the quest for land, treasure, and glory, but the systemic exploitation of women was a key component of their empire minus building. The women who were taken during these raids were not simply captured, they were commodified. Their lives were worth more than just what they could contribute in labor. They were seen as investments, valued for their ability to reproduce and multiply the supply of slaves. Every woman was categorized, sorted, and assigned a role based on her physical attributes and reproductive potential. This was not just the theft of bodies, it was the theft of their futures. The entire Viking economy, to some extent, relied on this system of human trafficking. The women who were captured and enslaved by the Vikings were forced into labor, but more importantly, they were made to bear children who would continue to serve their masters. These children were born into slavery, perpetuating the cycle for generations. Viking society, from the lowest farmstead to the grandest chieftain's hall, relied on this endless supply of forced labor to maintain its power and wealth. And at the center of this exploitation were the women, whose lives were valued only for their utility, not for their humanity. Yet, within this brutal system, there were moments of resistance, small though they were. Some women managed to escape, though only for short periods, while others fought back in more subtle ways. These acts of resistance were not always physical, but often psychological and emotional. Many of the women found ways to resist by preserving their cultures, passing down languages, stories, and traditions from their homelands. They taught their children the ways of their ancestors, ensuring that even in the darkest circumstances, a piece of their identity remained intact. These acts of cultural resistance were an essential part of their survival, and through them these women fought to hold on to the essence of who they were. In addition to this quiet resistance, there were also more direct acts of defiance. Women who worked in Viking kitchens and brewhouses often had access to food and drink which they could use to poison their captors. These slow acts of sabotage allowed them to take back some control over their lives, even if it meant sacrificing their own survival. Poison, the ritual of quiet rebellion, was often the only means these women had to fight back. A revenge, though short-lived, was a message to their captors that they would not be broken without a fight. However, resistance came at a high cost. For most women, their rebellion meant death. The Vikings were ruthless when it came to punishing those who defied them. Women who attempted to escape, those who poisoned their captors, and those who tried to resist in any form were often executed in brutal ways. These executions were meant not just to punish the individual, but to send a message to others. Resistance was futile, and the price for defiance was always death. Yet, even in death, some women managed to make their mark. Consider the women who were burned alongside Viking chieftains on funeral ships. These living sacrifices, as they were sometimes called, were often chosen to accompany their masters into the afterlife, ensuring their continued servitude beyond death. These women, though doomed to a tragic end, were not entirely powerless in the face of their fate. They knew the ritual that awaited them and could make the choice to volunteer, but that choice was often the only semblance of agency they had left. The stories of these sacrifices were meant to glorify the Viking warriors who died in battle. They were symbolic acts of loyalty and honor, but the truth behind these rituals is far darker. The women who were selected for these ceremonies were not honored, they were erased. Their lives were seen as expendable, their contributions to Viking society reduced to mere footnotes. These women, though, were more than just slaves. They were human beings who were forced into unimaginable circumstances, and while their names may never be known, their suffering is an essential part of Viking history. In many ways, the Viking Age can be understood as a story of duality. On one hand, it is a story of conquest and exploration, of men who sailed across the seas and built an empire that stretched from Iceland to Russia. On the other hand, it is a story of human suffering, of women whose lives were stolen from them, whose bodies were exploited for labor and reproduction, whose names were erased from history. These women, though forgotten by many, played a central role in shaping the Viking world. Their suffering was the foundation of Viking wealth and power, and yet their voices were silenced. Today, as we look back on Viking history, it is essential to remember these women not as nameless victims, but as people who lived, who endured, and who resisted. Their stories may have been erased from the official record, but they are not lost. Through modern research, through DNA studies, and through a deeper understanding of the Viking world, we can begin to reclaim their stories. We can acknowledge the price that was paid for Viking expansion, and we can recognize the resilience and strength of the women who, though silenced, were never forgotten. By remembering these women, we begin to understand the true cost of Viking conquests. We recognize that the Vikings were not just warriors and explorers, they were human traffickers, and the women they enslaved were the backbone of their empire. Their suffering built the Viking world, and their legacy is something that must be acknowledged and honored. The Vikings, as we often remember them, were ruthless conquerors, explorers, and warriors. Their legacy is intertwined with images of mighty long ships slicing through the seas, but battles fought and lands won. But the more we look at their expansion, the clearer it becomes that their empire was built not just on their skill in battle, but on a deeply ingrained system of exploitation, particularly of women. These women, whose names we will never know, whose identities were erased, are integral to understanding the Viking world and its success. When the Vikings raided, they didn't just capture land and treasure, they captured people. Women especially were a central part of these raids. Their bodies were not just plundered for the sake of survival, but for the continuation of the Viking economy. The Vikings' ruthless efficiency in capturing untrading women reveals a chilling aspect of their empire minus building. Women were valued not for their humanity, but for their ability to work and reproduce, to provide labor and to create the next generation of slaves. This systematic exploitation was just a byproduct of Viking conquests. It was the cornerstone upon which their empire was built. The economic machinery of Viking society ran on human suffering, and women were at the heart of that machinery. They were used as tools to further the ambitions of Viking chieftains, their lives reduced to mere commodities. Some women were selected for their beauty, others for their ability to labor, and still others for their potential to produce more slaves. And just like any other property, they were bought and sold, transported across vast distances, and used to fuel the growing Viking world. Yet, these women were not passive victims of their circumstances. They resisted, they fought, and they found ways to survive in a system designed to break them. The quiet acts of defiance, the small rebellions, are part of their legacy, even if those acts didn't bring them freedom. In the stories of women like Dear who poisoned her captors in revenge for the loss of her family, we see that the spirit of resistance was never fully extinguished. These women may have been caught, punished, and killed, but they left a mark on Viking society, one that was felt even by those who profited from their suffering. Their resistance wasn't always physical. It was also cultural, emotional, and psychological. By passing down stories, preserving languages, and teaching their children the ways of their ancestors, enslaved women found ways to assert their identities in a world that sought to erase them. They may not have had the power to escape, but they found ways to resist cultural annihilation. This cultural preservation was a form of defiance, a reminder that, no matter how much the Vikings tried to erase them, these women still existed. The Vikings may have erased their names from the historical record, but their legacy is still here. Through genetic studies, we can see the impact of Viking slavery. In Iceland, for example, modern DNA analysis has shown that while the male lineage of the population is predominantly Norse, the female lineage is largely Celtic, reflecting the large scale abduction and trafficking of women during Viking raids. These women, though forgotten in most historical accounts, live on in the bloodlines of those who call Scandinavia home. This legacy is a painful one, a history of suffering, exploitation, and erasure. But it is also a testament to the resilience of these women. Despite the brutality they endured, they managed to preserve something of their identity. In doing so, they resisted the system that sought to erase them. And in their small acts of rebellion, they fought for their humanity. Today, when we think of Vikings, we must remember that their empire wasn't just built on warriors and ships. It was built on the backs of women whose suffering was an essential part of their success. These women were not passive figures, they were integral to the Viking world, and their stories deserve to be told. The Vikings may have erased their names, but their suffering is still present in the very fabric of Viking history. As we continue to study and learn about the Viking Age, we must acknowledge the full scope of their impact. We must recognize that their empire was not just built on exploration and conquest, it was also built on the systematic abuse and exploitation of women. These women, though largely forgotten by history, played a central role in the Viking world, and we owe it to them to ensure their stories are not lost forever. We live in a world where the stories of those who suffer in silence are often overlooked, but by shedding light on the history of Viking slavery, we can begin to understand the true cost of their empire. The wealth, the power, and the territory that the Vikings amassed were not just the result of their military prowess. They were the result of a deeply exploitative system that relied on the labor and suffering of enslaved women. In remembering these women, we acknowledge the truth of Viking expansion, a truth that is often left out of the official record. By honoring their memory, we can begin to recognize the full history of the Vikings, and the women who were essential to that history, but whose names and experiences have been hidden for too long. As we continue to explore the full scope of Viking history, it is crucial to acknowledge the systemic exploitation that shaped their society. The grand tales of Viking warriors, their long ships, and their conquests often overshadow the darker truths, the realities of how their empire was built. Beneath the stories of glory and adventure lies a painful history of human trafficking, especially of women, whose bodies were commodified and used as tools to fuel Viking society. For the women captured during Viking raids, survival was not simply about enduring their new circumstances, it was about navigating a world that saw them as nothing more than property. They were not given names but numbers. They were not seen as individuals with families, dreams, and histories, but as objects meant to serve the economic needs of their captors. The system of Viking slavery stripped these women of their identities and reduced them to tools for labor and reproduction. Yet, even in the face of such degradation, these women managed to assert their humanity, often in ways that are still felt today. Their stories may not be recorded in sagas or chronicled by historians, but the traces of their existence are preserved in unexpected places. Modern genetic studies reveal that the women who were taken during Viking raids left their mark on the populations they were forced into. The DNA of these enslaved women is embedded in the genetic makeup of Northern Europeans. A reminder that the Vikings were not just conquerors, they were traffickers of human lives, and the expansion of their empire was directly tied to the suffering of countless women. One of the most striking aspects of this legacy is how deeply the Vikings relied on the reproduction and labor of enslaved women to maintain their empire. These women were not only used for their physical labor, grinding grain, tending fields, or working as domestic servants, they were also used as breeding vessels, forced to produce more slaves for the Viking economy. Their children were born into captivity, and from the moment they took their first breath, they were part of the system of exploitation that ensured Viking society continued to thrive. This system of forced reproduction wasn't just about maintaining a labor force, it was about creating an unbreakable cycle. As the children of enslaved women grew up, they were often subjected to the same fate as their mothers. Their lives were predetermined from birth, their futures mapped out in a world that saw them as nothing more than extensions of the men who owned them. For generations, this cycle continued, with women and children wrapped in a system designed to ensure that they would never escape. And yet, despite the harshness of this system, some women fought back. While escape was nearly impossible for most, resistance still found a way to exist. For some, it came in the form of cultural preservation. These women taught their children the stories, languages, and customs of their homelands, ways to keep their heritage alive in a world that sought to erase it. These small acts of resistance were not just about survival, they were about defiance. They were about refusing to let their identity be stolen along with their bodies. For others, resistance came in the form of direct action. Women who worked in the kitchens or brew houses often had access to food and drink, which they could use to poison their captors. Slowly and subtly, they sabotaged the very system that enslaved them. While these acts of rebellion rarely resulted in permanent change, they represented something profound: the refusal to submit to a life of total subjugation. Through poison, through sabotage, through small acts of defiance, these women reminded their captors that they were human beings, not property. But for most, the only way to resist was to endure. An entrance in a system like the one the Vikings built often meant giving up everything that made a person who they were. The women captured in Viking raids didn't just lose their homes, they lost their identities. They were forced to adopt new names, new roles, and new lands, all while being treated as nothing more than tools for the Viking economy. But even as their identities were erased, their humanity could not be fully extinguished. The legacy of Viking slavery is not just one of exploitation, it is a legacy of survival. Despite the brutality they endured, the women who were captured during Viking raids found ways to preserve their sense of self. Their resistance, though small and often unnoticed, left a lasting impact on Viking society. It showed that, even in the darkest times, the human spirit can find a way to fight back, to assert its dignity, and to survive. This legacy is one that deserves to be remembered. The Vikings may have been brutal conquerors, but the women they enslaved played an essential role in the success of their empire. They were the unseen laborers, the silent survivors, the forgotten ones whose suffering fueled the Viking machine. Their stories may not be told in sagas or written records, but they are woven into the very fabric of Viking history. And by acknowledging their existence, we honor their memory and ensure that they are not forgotten. As we move forward in understanding Viking history, it is essential to acknowledge the complexities of their empire. Yes, they were explorers and warriors, but they were also traffickers. And their empire was built on the backs of enslaved women. These women were not just victims of Viking raids, they were victims of a larger system that saw them as property, as tools, as commodities. And yet, they resisted, they fought, and they survived. In doing so, they became part of Viking history, even if their names were never recorded. Their suffering is not just a footnote in Viking achievements, it is central to understanding the full scope of Viking expansion. The wealth that funded Viking conquest came at an immense cost, one that is still felt today. By remembering these women, we can begin to understand the true cost of Viking expansion and the role that women played in building the empire that we now romanticize. In modern times, we tend to view history through a narrow lens, often focusing on the heroes, the warriors, and the conquerors who shaped the world as we know it. The Vikings, with their fierce reputation and extraordinary feats of exploration, have become one of the most iconic civilizations in history. However, what we often overlook are the millions of untold stories, the stories of those who never had a voice in the grand narrative. Among these forgotten voices are the women whose lives were appended, whose identities were erased, and whose suffering laid the foundation for Viking success. It's important to understand that the Vikings' empire was not solely built on their battles and conquests. The very infrastructure that supported their raids and expeditions depended on a system of human trafficking, specifically the trafficking of women. These women were captured, enslaved, and used in ways that were both brutal and strategic. Their labor, reproduction, and even their very bodies were commodified, traded, and exploited in a way that was central to the Vikings' expansion. Viking raids were not just about looting monasteries and villages for riches. They were about capturing people, primarily women, and turning them into valuable assets. The Vikings needed women not just for labor, but for reproduction. These women were seen as tools, whose ability to bear children ensured a constant supply of new slaves to perpetuate the system. The cycle of exploitation and suffering continued, generation after generation, as these women's children were born into the same fate. The Vikings didn't just take women to work in their households. They were integral to the economic machinery of Viking society. Whether they walked the fields, ground grain, cared for livestock, or served in households, their labor was essential to the functioning of Viking settlements. But it wasn't just about physical labor. Women were used for reproductive purposes to ensure the continuity of slavery. This was a deliberate, systematic process that relied on their ability to reproduce. The more children they had, the more valuable they became both to their captors and to the Viking society as a whole. Despite being reduced to property, some women found ways to fight back. In the face of such overwhelming brutality, they resisted in whatever ways they could. Some poisoned their captors, others sabotaged the work they were forced to do. These acts of resistance may have seemed small in the grand scheme of things, but they were powerful. They represented a refusal to submit, a refusal to accept a life of servitude without resistance. Even in the darkest corners of their captivity, these women found ways to assert their humanity. But it was just through acts of defiance that these women resisted. They also fought through survival. The mere fact that they endured their bodies, minds, and spirits surviving in the face of unthinkable cruelty was a form of resistance. They may have been trapped, but they refused to be completely broken. Through their survival, they became the silent witnesses to the history of Viking society, a history that would have been incomplete without their existence. For too long, these women have been forgotten, their stories erased. The sagas, the chronicles, and the popular narratives about Vikings focus on the men who raided and explored, but the women who were enslaved, whose labor and suffering made those raids and explorations possible, were left out. They are seen as little more than footnotes, if mentioned at all. Their suffering is hidden in the shadows, even as the Vikings' triumphs are celebrated in museums and books. But the truth is that the Viking success was built on the backs of these women. The wealth that funded Viking expeditions, the treasures they plundered, the lands they conquered, all of it came at the expense of these women's lives. Their bodies were the raw material of Viking expansion, their labor and reproduction fueling the growth of Viking settlements and the perpetuation of the slave trade. The Vikings could not have achieved what they did without the suffering of the women they enslaved. The Vikings' legacy is not just one in exploration and war. It is a legacy of exploitation, of the systematic use of human bodies to create an empire. And at the center of that empire were the women whose names were forgotten, whose lives were reduced to mere property. These women, however, were not just victims. They were survivors. They resisted. They fought. And in doing so, they left a mark on Viking history that can no longer be ignored. By remembering these women, we can begin to understand the true cost of Viking expansion. We can acknowledge the role that their suffering played in the creation of the Viking Empire. We can see that the wealth, the power, and the legacy of the Vikings were not just the result of their military conquest, but were also tied to the exploitation of women. These women were essential to the Vikings' success, and it is time we recognize their contributions to history. The legacy of Viking slavery is not just a story of brutality, it is a story of survival, resilience, and resistance. Despite being erased from the written record, these women's lives are woven into the very fabric of Viking history. Their suffering is the hidden foundation of Viking expansion. and their strength is a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure even in the most dire of circumstances. Today, as we study Viking history, we must acknowledge these women. We must give them the recognition they deserve. Their suffering was not an accident or an afterthought. It was central to the Viking way of life. And it is time we gave them the space in history that they were denied. By remembering these women, we honor their lives, their resilience, and their strength, and we ensure that their suffering is never forgotten. As we delve deeper into the history of the Vikings, it becomes clear that their empire was not just the result of their wars and conquests, but of a deeply entrenched system of exploitation, particularly of women. These women, though largely erased from the pages of history, were the silent foundation upon which the Viking world was built. They were not just passive figures, they were essential to the economic and social structure that allowed Viking society to thrive. When we think of Vikings, we often imagine fierce warriors, skilled sailors, and daring explorers. But behind these celebrated figures were the women who were captured, enslaved, and subjected to unimaginable cruelty. These women were not just victims, they were commodities, traded like any other resource to fuel the Viking economy. Their bodies were not their own. They belonged to the men who captured them, and through their labor and reproduction, they became the engine that powered Viking expansion. Viking society as we know it could not have existed without the systematic exploitation of women. The wealth generated from the slave trade, from the forced labor of women in the fields and households, provided the Vikings with the resources they needed to continue their raids, to fund their ships, and to expand their territories. These women were not just tools for physical labor, they were vital to the survival of Viking culture, to the perpetuation of its military and economic dominance. And yet, the stories have largely been lost to history. Through the act of enslaving women, the Vikings ensured that their empire would continue. These women were used to generate wealth, to produce the next generation of slaves, and to support the Viking way of life. The children born to these enslaved women inherited their status, ensuring that the cycle of exploitation would continue. The Vikings didn't just take women for labor, they took them to ensure that their empire would endure long after their initial conquests were over. Despite this, these women found ways to resist. They may not have been able to escape, but they fought back in other ways. Some resisted through small acts of sabotage, poisoning their captors or destroying their master's property. Others, like Deirdre, took more direct action, poisoning their captors in revenge for the loss of their families. Though their resistance often ended in death, these women's defiance left a mark on Viking society. They showed that, even in the most brutal circumstances, the human spirit could find a way to resist oppression. Other women resisted in quieter ways. They passed down their stories, their languages, and their traditions, ensuring that even in captivity, their cultures survived. These acts of cultural resistance were not just about survival, they were about identity. By preserving their heritage, these women ensured that, even if their physical bodies were enslaved, their minds and souls remained free. These small, quiet rebellions kept their stories alive, even when the written record tried to forget them. The legacy of these women is one that has been overlooked for centuries, but it is not one that should remain forgotten. The Vikings may have erased their names from history, but their contributions to Viking society were undeniable. The labor and reproduction of enslaved women were central to the success of the Viking Empire. Without them, the raids, the conquests, and the wealth would not have been possible. These women were the unseen laborers, the silent survivors, the forgotten ones whose suffering and resilience were integral to Viking expansion. Today, we are beginning to uncover these hidden stories. Through archaeology, DNA studies, and historical research, we are slowly piecing together the lost history of Viking slavery. We are starting to recognize the full extent of the exploitation of women during the Viking Age, and we are beginning to honor their memory. The wealth and power of the Viking Empire were built on their suffering, and it is time we recognize that. By remembering these women, we can begin to understand the true cost of Viking expansion. The wealth and success of the Vikings were not just the result of their military prowess, they were the result of a system that trafficked in human lives. These women were not just slaves, they were the foundation upon which Viking society was built. Their suffering fueled the growth of the empire, and their resilience helped preserve their cultures in the face of unimaginable adversity. It's time for us to acknowledge this part of Viking history, to recognize the role that women played in building the Viking Empire, and to give them the recognition they deserve. Their stories may have been erased from the official record, but they live on in the traces of DNA left behind, in the memories of those who were captured, and in the defiant acts of resistance that still echo through history. These women were not just property, they were human beings, with names, with stories, and with legacies that deserve to be remembered. As we continue to learn more about the Vikings and their impact on the world, we must not forget the women whose lives were intertwined with their empire. They may have been erased from history, but they were not invisible. Their suffering, their resilience, and their resistance are part of the larger story of Viking expansion. And they are a crucial part of understanding the true legacy of the Vikings. By acknowledging these women, we honor their memory and ensure that their voices are finally heard. As we confront the history of the Vikings, it's impossible to ignore the fundamental role that enslaved women played in the creation of their empire. The tales of Viking raids, their legendary warriors, and their voyages of discovery often overshadow the darker truths that are embedded in their success. These women, whose lives were stolen in the pursuit of Viking wealth and power, were the silent figures whose suffering remains central to the Viking legacy. For centuries, the stories of these women were erased, forgotten, or relegated to the background. History, as written by those in power, preferred to focus on the conquerors, the warriors, and the kings who shaped the Viking Age. But the reality of Viking conquest was far more complex and deeply rooted in a system that trafficked in human lives, especially the lives of women. These women were not mere casualties of war, they were the backbone of Viking society, the workers who kept the engine of empire running. The Vikings did not just raid for treasure. They raided for people they could use, trade, and exploit. The women they captured were divided into groups based on their perceived value, those who were oft unsold to distant markets, while older women and those who were in less useful were kept for labor. These women were stripped of their identities and their humanity. They were commodities, no different than the grain or livestock that the Vikings plundered. Their lives, their futures were determined not by their own will but by the men who captured and sold them. But even in such a brutal system, the women found ways to survive. Some, like the infamous Dira, fought back by poisoning their captors, striking at those who held the power over their lives. Others resisted in quieter ways through cultural preservation, passing down their languages, customs, and stories to their children. These small acts of defiance, though oft unpunished with death, were the last vestiges of power these women had. They were reminders that even in captivity, these women were not entirely broken. Their humanity survived, despite everything. The story of Viking slavery is not just about the brutality of conquest. It is about the resilience of the human spirit. These women, forced into servitude, denied their basic rights, and often subjected to horrific treatment, fought for survival in ways that left an indelible mark on the Viking world. Their acts of resistance, even if they didn't lead to freedom, were powerful declarations of their dignity, or their refusal to be reduced to mere property. One of the most tragic elements of Viking slavery was how it perpetuated itself. Women who were captured and enslaved by the Vikings were often forced to bear children who would, in turn, be born into slavery. The cycle of exploitation was unbreakable, passed down from mother to child. These children, who knew nothing but a life of captivity, were raised to become the next generation of slaves. This generational bondage created an unrelenting system that ensured the Vikings would never run out of laborers. It also meant that the suffering of enslaved women was inherited, perpetuating a cycle of pain and servitude that lasted for generations. In Iceland, where Viking society took root, the remnants of this system can still be seen. Through genetic research, scientists have discovered that the female lineage of Icelandic people is not predominantly Norse, but Celtic, reflecting the high number of women from Ireland, Scotland, and other regions who were captured and trafficked during Viking raids. These women, though erased from written history, live on in the very DNA of the population. They are the forgotten ancestors of the modern world. This genetic legacy is a stark reminder of the systemic exploitation that powered the Viking Empire. While the male lineage of Viking society may be celebrated in sagas and stories, it is the female lineage, those women whose bodies were used to fuel the empire, that has left an indelible mark on history. The Vikings may have built their empire with ships and swords, but it was the bodies of enslaved women that provided the labor and reproductive power necessary for their success. By understanding this, we begin to see the Vikings not as heroes, but as perpetrators of a system of exploitation and human trafficking. The wealth, the power, and the territorial expansion that the Vikings enjoyed were all made possible by the subjugation of women. These women were essential to Viking society, not just as laborers, but as breeders of future generations of slaves. The empire the Vikings built was not just a military conquest, but a conquest of the human spirit, one that exploited the bodies of women to ensure its survival. This reality has been hidden for too long. We have romanticized the Viking Age, celebrating their victories and conquests while ignoring the cost that was paid in human lives. The stories of the men who lead the raids, the kings who ruled the territories, and the warriors who fought are well known, but the women who were captured, enslaved, and exploited are hardly mentioned. They are forgotten victims in a history that only remembers the conquerors. It is time to change that. We must give these women the recognition they deserve. They were not just victims, they were survivors. They resisted in small, but powerful ways. They preserved their cultures, fought back when they could, and endured unimaginable hardship. Their stories deserve to be told, not as footnotes in the grand tale of Viking conquests, but as integral pieces of the Viking legacy. By remembering these women, we can begin to understand the true cost of Viking expansion. The empire the Vikings built was not just a triumph of war and exploration. It was built on the backs of the women they enslaved. Their labor, their suffering, and their resilience were central to the success of the Viking Empire. It's time we recognize this and honor the memory of those who were erased from the pages of history. The Viking Age is often remembered as an era of bold explorers and fearless warriors. But the reality is that this period of history also rested on a brutal system of exploitation that continues to be largely overlooked. The Vikings' power and success weren't only built on the strength of their warriors and their long ships, they were also built on the backs of women, whose lives were reduced to commodities, and whose suffering played a crucial role in the expansion of the Viking Empire. His enslaved women were not just a side effect of the Viking raids, they were central to the functioning of Viking society. While men fought in battles and sailed across seas, women worked the fields, tended the homes, and kept the settlements running. They were the hidden labor force that fueled Viking life. But it was just labor that the Vikings sought, they also needed women to reproduce. The children born to these women were automatically enslaved, ensuring the system of exploitation would continue through generations. The Vikings understood that a slave economy could not survive without a continuous supply of new slaves. And so women became the reproductive engines of their empire. The cyclical nature of this system meant that these women's lives were predetermined from birth. For many, their fates were sealed long before they had any say in their futures. They were captured as children or young women, transported across vast distances, and forced into lives of servitude. Their status was passed on to their children, meaning the cycle of captivity would continue indefinitely unless broken. Many of these women spent their entire lives in the Viking system, never knowing freedom, and dying without ever being remembered as more than property. Yet, the women who were enslaved by the Vikings weren't just passive figures, they resisted in small, often subtle ways. They fought to maintain their dignity, even in the most oppressive of conditions. Some resisted through sabotage, poisoning their captors, or destroying their master's property. Others fought back more quietly by preserving their cultures. They taught their children the language and traditions of their homelands, ensuring that their identities survived even if their bodies were enslaved. These small acts of defiance kept their cultures alive, and in doing so, they defied the very system that sought to erase them. While the Viking Empire thrived on the suffering of these women, it also depended on their ability to reproduce, to create the next generation of slaves. Women were seen not just as workers, but as breeders' tools to perpetuate the cycle of slavery. They were forced to have children who, just like them, would be born into a system designed to strip them of their freedom. These children became part of a larger system, one that kept the Viking world running on the labor of the enslaved. This process ensured that the Vikings had a steady supply of slaves for years to come. It is a stark reminder of the depths of Viking exploitation, that so much of their success was dependent on the bodies of enslaved women. These women were central to the Vikings' ability to continue their conquests and raids. They were the hidden workers who allowed the Vikings to expand, their suffering a necessary part of the Viking system. Yet, as the Viking Empire flourished, their voices remained silenced. Their stories were erased, their lives forgotten, and their suffering overshadowed by the glorification of Viking warriors. But these women's stories are not lost entirely. Through DNA studies and archaeological research, we are beginning to uncover their legacy. The genetic traces of these women can still be found in modern populations, particularly in the regions where the Vikings settled. In Iceland, for example, genetic studies show that the female lineage of the population is primarily Celtic, with a significant percentage of women coming from regions like Ireland and Scotland. These women's bloodlines were carried across Viking territories, ensuring that their genetic legacy, though their names were erased, lives on today. The historical erasure of these women's stories is not just a tragedy, it's a reflection of how history has often ignored or downplayed the suffering of women. The Vikings, like many societies throughout history, created narratives that celebrated the actions of men while marginalizing the roles and experiences of women. Women in Viking society were not just property, they were the very foundation of the system that allowed that society to thrive. Without them, the Vikings would not have been able to achieve the power and wealth they enjoyed. But their roles were not limited to labor and reproduction. In some ways, the Vikings' treatment of women was far more complex. While many were used as tools for labor, others, particularly those deemed special, were sold to wealthy buyers and farm-off lands. These women were often trained, dressed, and sold as high-price commodities in slave markets. Their beauty and youth were seen as valuable assets, bought by traders who sold them to the highest bidder in places like Byzantium or the Middle East. These women, though still subjected to exploitation, had a different kind of value in Viking society, one based on their physical appearance, rather than their ability to work or reproduce. This process of commodification extended beyond mere enslavement. It was about reducing women to their economic value, about stripping away their humanity and turning them into assets for trade. The Vikings may have been brutal, but they were also calculating. They understood that women were central to the creation of wealth, and they treated them accordingly. They trafficked in human lives, not just for labor, but for the economic benefit that came from selling and trading women across their expansive networks. The economic value of women in Viking society was reflected in the way they were treated and categorized. Some women were selected for hard labor, others for breeding, and still others for their beauty, making them valuable commodities to be traded across vast distances. The wealth generated by this trade fueled Viking expansion, allowing them to build an empire based not only on their conquests, but on the exploitation of women. This economic structure, which sustained the Viking world, was driven by the labor and reproduction of enslaved women who were reduced to nothing more than tools to maintain the Vikings' power. The true cost of Viking conquests lies hidden in the shadows of history, woven into the fabric of their empire. The Vikings may be remembered for their strength, their ships, and their fearless exploration, but the wealth that allowed them to sail across oceans and expand their empire was built on the labor and suffering of enslaved women. This is a story that has been silenced for centuries, a story that deserves to be told in full. These women were not simply victims of Viking raids. They were essential to the Viking raids, they were essential to the Viking way of life. Their forced labor powered Viking farms, households, and cities. They were the ones who ground the grain, cared for the animals, wove the cloth, and raised the next generation. Their ability to bear children ensured that the Viking Empire would continue, with new generations of enslaved people to support the growing demand for labor. The reproductive labor of these women was just as valuable, if not more so, than their physical labor. Without it, the Viking system of expansion could not have endured, but their contributions have largely been overlooked, their suffering erased from the narrative of Viking greatness. We remember the warriors, the chieftains, and the explorers, but we have forgotten the women whose bodies were the foundation of that empire. These women were sold and traded like livestock, their lives valued only for what they could provide, whether in labor, reproduction, or physical beauty. They were the silent workers behind the Viking machine, the forgotten figures whose suffering was essential to Viking success. Their erasure from history is not just a historical oversight, it is a reflection of how women's suffering has often been ignored in the construction of empire. Throughout history, the labor and bodies of women have been exploited to fuel the ambitions of conquerors, and the Vikings were no exception. The glory of their raids and their empire was not just the result of their warriors' skills, it was made possible by the women who were enslaved, commodified, and erased. It's time to reclaim their stories, to bring them out of the shadows and into the light. By recognizing the true cost of Viking expansion, we can better understand the foundations of Viking society. Their empire was not just built on war and conquest, it was built on a system of slavery that relied on the forced labor of women. These women's lives were not just a side note in Viking history, they were central to its success. Their exploitation, their suffering, and their resilience were what made Viking expansion possible. The stories of these women may not have been written down in sagas, but they are preserved in the genetic records, in the traces they left behind in the very bones of their descendants. Modern genetic studies have uncovered the fact that a significant portion of the Icelandic population carries genetic markers that trace back to these enslaved women. Their legacy is written not in words, but in the DNA of modern Northern Europeans. These women, whose names were lost to time, live on in the bloodlines of the very people who now celebrate Viking warriors. This genetic legacy serves as a testament to the enduring impact of Viking slavery. These women may have been erased from history, but they have not been forgotten. Their bodies, their labor, and their suffering contributed to the shaping of Viking society. Through modern science, we are able to reconnect with their lost histories, acknowledging that the Vikings' power and influence were not solely the result of their warriors' raids, but were also the result of a deeply entrenched system of human exploitation. By remembering these women, we are not just honoring the victims of Viking slavery, we are also recognizing the profound ways in which their suffering shaped the world we live in today. Their story is not just a tragedy, it is a call to confront the uncomfortable truths that have been buried for too long. The Viking Empire may have been built on conquests, but it was also built on human suffering. These women, though forgotten, were integral to that process, and it is time we remember them. It's easy to admire the Vikings for their daring raids and impressive conquests, but it's much harder to confront the darker aspects of their legacy, the exploitation of human lives that was central to their success. By acknowledging the role of enslaved women in Viking society, we can begin to understand the true cost of their empire. We can no longer celebrate Viking conquest without acknowledging the brutal system that allowed them to flourish. This understanding is not just about historical accuracy, it's about recognizing the voices that have been silenced for centuries. The stories of enslaved women may never be fully recovered, but we can begin to piece together the fragments of their lives. By doing so, we can finally acknowledge their humanity, their strength, and their resistance. The Vikings' empire may have been built on the suffering of women, but their legacy is not defined by that suffering alone. It is also defined by the resilience, the resistance, and the survival of those women who endured. We must not forget that Viking success was not just the result of raids, ships, and warriors. It was also the result of a system of exploitation that relied on enslaved women. These women were the foundation of Viking society, and their stories deserve to be told. It is time for us to finally recognize the full scope of Viking history, not just the glory of the warriors, but the hidden cost of their empire. By doing so, we honor the lives of the women who built that empire, even though history has largely forgotten them. The Vikings may have left behind a legacy of exploration and warfare, but the true foundation of their empire was something far darker, one built on the backs of women whose suffering was systematically erased from the history books. The battles won, the lands conquered, and the wealth amassed were all made possible by the forced labor and exploitation of women. Their stories are largely forgotten, but their role in the Viking world was undeniable. Through history, the stories we celebrate are often those of the victims, the conquerors, and the heroes. These narratives glorify the warriors, the kings, and the explorers. The women who were captured and enslaved are rarely mentioned, and when they are often depicted as passive figures, victims of circumstance. But this narrative is incomplete. These women were not just victims, they were central to the Viking economy, to its military success, and to the very structure of Viking society. The Vikings didn't just conquer lands, they built an empire on the systematic enslavement of women. These women were not just used as laborers in the fields or as house servants, they were exploited for their ability to reproduce, creating the next generation of slaves. Their children were born into captivity, perpetuating a cycle of enslavement that spanned generations. This was not just about taking women for forced labor, it was about creating a self-sustaining system of exploitation. The Vikings were savvy in their exploitation. They understood that to build a lasting empire, they needed more than just soldiers. They needed a steady supply of slaves to maintain their wealth and power. Women were the linchpin of this system. Their labor powered the Viking world, from the grindstones in the kitchens to the fields where grain was harvested. Their reproductive capacity ensured that the empire could expand and endure. For the Vikings, enslaved women were as vital to their conquests as the warriors who raided the villages. Yet, despite this systemic exploitation, these women found ways to resist. They fought back in small, subtle ways, asserting their humanity even in the most dire of circumstances. Some poisoned their captors, others sabotaged the work they were forced to do. Even in captivity, they fought to maintain their identity, to preserve their culture, and to pass on their heritage to their children. These acts of defiance, though often small and fleeting, were powerful reminders that these women were not merely property, they were human beings, with their own agency, their own lives, and their own will. As we uncover the hidden history of Viking slavery, it's clear that the suffering of these women was not an incidental byproduct of Viking conquest. It was the foundation upon which the Viking Empire was built. The trade in human lives, particularly the trafficking of women, was integral to Viking success. Without this system of exploitation, the Vikings would not have been able to achieve the wealth, the power, and the expansion that they did. The Vikings may have been feared for their raids and their conquests, but it is the women they enslaved who truly built their empire. The Vikings' success was fueled not just by the strength of their warriors, but by the labor, the suffering, and the resilience of women who were captured, commodified, and forgotten. It is time for us to remember these women not as nameless victims, but as individuals whose suffering was central to the Viking Empire. These women were not just background figures in the Viking story, they were key players in its success. Their labor, their bodies, their resilience, and their defiance made the Viking world possible. We can no longer tell the story of the Vikings without acknowledging the women who were integral to their empire minus building. These women deserve recognition not as victims, but as survivors who endured unimaginable hardship. They resisted, they fought, and they survived. Their story, though often forgotten, is crucial to understanding Viking history. It is time we honor their memory, recognize their suffering, and ensure that their stories are told. The Vikings may have written their own history, but the women they enslaved are the ones whose blood and sweat fueled that history. Their legacy is not just one of tragedy, it is one of strength, resistance, and survival. By remembering them, we can finally give these women the recognition they deserve, ensuring that their suffering is not erased, but acknowledged as a central part of the Viking legacy. As we reflect on Viking history, we must acknowledge the role that the systemic exploitation of women played in shaping the empire we know today. The Vikings, often celebrated as fierce warriors, explorers, and conquerors, built their wealth, power, and territory on a foundation of human trafficking and exploitation. The majority of their success was not only due to their military prowess or their ships, it was also the direct result of the forced labor and suffering of enslaved women. These women were the unseen workers behind the Viking economy, and without them, the raids and conquests that defined the Viking legacy could never have been sustained. While men fought battles and built kingdoms, enslaved women worked tirelessly in homes, fields, and households, producing the goods and resources that allowed Viking settlements to flourish. These women were captured during raids, divided into categories based on age, health, and beauty, and then sold or traded across vast distances. Their bodies became tools to build a powerful empire, yet their stories have been all but erased from Viking history. What is often forgotten is that Viking society, at its core, was built on a system that exploited women in ways that were not merely brutal, but deeply structured. The trade in women was an economic cornerstone of the Viking world. These women didn't just serve as laborers, they were also used as breeding vessels. The children born to enslaved women were automatically born into slavery, perpetuating the cycle of exploitation. The system ensured that there would always be a supply of enslaved people to meet the demands of Viking society, thus strengthening the empire for generations. But these women were more than mere tools. They were human beings who fought for survival, resisted when they could, and persevered through unimaginable suffering. While the Viking world may have been built on their labor and their bodies, it was also shaped by their resilience and defiance. From small acts of rebellion to preserving their cultures and languages, these women found ways to assert their humanity. Even in captivity, they fought to maintain their dignity, pass on their heritage, and resist the complete terror of their identities. One of the most harrowing aspects of Viking slavery was the permanence of it. Women who were enslaved were not only forced into a life of grueling labor, they were also trapped in a system that denied them the possibility of escape. Their children were born into slavery, bound by the same chains their mothers had been shackled with. This intergenerational cycle of enslavement meant that many women would never know a life outside the system. But even in the face of such a fate, these women fought to survive. Some resisted by poisoning their captors, others by engaging in small acts of sabotage, while many preserved their cultures and passed on their knowledge to their children. While these acts of resistance may seem small, they were incredibly significant in a world that sought to erase the very identities of enslaved women. The women who survived in Viking society may not have had control over their circumstances, but they did have control over how they chose to endure. The acts of resistance they carried out, whether through language, culture, or even sabotage, showed that even in the most dire situations, the human spirit can find ways to fight back. Yet, their stories remained largely untold for centuries. History has traditionally been written by those in power: the conquerors, the warriors, and the kings. The stories of those who suffered in silence, like the enslaved women of the Vikings, have been overshadowed by the grand narratives of conquest and empire minus building. The warriors, the chieftains, and the explorers are the ones we remember, while the women whose bodies fueled their success are left forgotten. But we can no longer afford to ignore the contribution of these women. The Viking Empire may have been built on the strength of its warriors, but it was also built on the bodies of enslaved women whose suffering and labor were the hidden foundation of Viking society. The wealth and power that the Vikings amassed were not just the result of military conquest, but the result of a system that commodified human lives, particularly women's lives. These women were essential to the expansion and prosperity of the Viking Empire, and their stories deserve to be remembered. It's time to give these women the recognition they have long been denied. They were not mere footnotes in the history of Viking conquest, they were central to its success. Their labor, their resilience, and their resistance were essential to the empire the Vikings built. By remembering them, we acknowledge the true cost of Viking expansion. The Vikings may have been great warriors, but the women they enslaved were the ones who made that greatness possible. Their suffering was not incidental, it was foundational. And it is time we recognize that. The Vikings were more than just explorers and conquerors, they were traffickers in human lives. The empire they built was not just built on battles won, but on human suffering. These women were the silent workers, the forgotten contributors, whose legs were used to fuel the Viking machine. It's time we recognize their central role in Viking history and remember them as more than just victims. They were survivors, they resisted, and they left a lasting impact on the Viking world. The Vikings' legacy is incomplete without acknowledging the role of enslaved women in its creation. These women were not just casualties of war, they were integral to Viking success. They were essential to the functioning of Viking society, and it is time we honor their memory and recognize the full scope of Viking expansion. By doing so, we can begin to heal the errors of their voices and ensure that their suffering is not forgotten, but understood as a central part of the Viking legacy. As we continue to explore the Viking legacy, we must confront the harsh reality that their empire was built not just on bloodshed and conquest, but on a system of exploitation that directly targeted women. These women, whose lives were shaped by captivity, forced labor, and the reproductive needs of the empire, are oft unrelegated to the margins of Viking history. But without their labor and suffering, the Viking Empire would not have survived or thrived as it did. The Vikings are often depicted as invincible warriors and fearless explorers, their long ships cutting through the seas, their raids stretching across Europe. But behind their battles, behind their adventures were the women who were captured, trafficked, and reduced to property. These women were not just passive victims, they were essential to the Vikings' ability to expand their empire and maintain their way of life. The labor they provided, the children they bore, and the resilience they showed under unimaginable circumstances were integral to Viking success. The reality of Viking conquest, however, was that it was not just about seizing land or plundering treasures, it was about controlling and exploiting human lives. The Vikings captured women during their raids and turned them into tools for reproduction and labor. These women were often kept as household servants, tasked with maintaining the homes and farms of Viking leaders, while others were used to breed the next generation of slaves. The children born from these enslaved women were immediately subjected to the same fate, ensuring that the cycle of exploitation would continue for generations. But these women did not simply submit to their fate. Even within the crushing system of Viking slavery, they found ways to resist. Some fought back through small acts of rebellion, like sabotaging the work they were forced to do or poisoning their captors. Others maintained their identity by preserving their cultures and languages, passing them down to their children in secret. These acts of defiance, though often small and fleeting, were vital in asserting the humanity of the enslaved women. They refused to let their culture, their language, and their identity be erased. Their stories, however, are largely absent from Viking records. While Viking warriors are celebrated in sagas and history books, the women who were enslaved and exploited are barely mentioned. Their suffering, which was essential to the Vikings' wealth and power, has been relegated to footnotes or ignored entirely. The women who powered Viking society, who fueled its expansion, are often forgotten, their stories buried in the shadows of history. But they were not just victims, they were survivors. And their contributions to Viking society cannot be overlooked. Through modern science, we can begin to uncover the stories of these forgotten women. DNA studies have shown that many of the people living in Viking settlements today carry genetic markers that trace back to enslaved women from the raids. This genetic legacy is a reminder that these women, though erased from the official record, left an indelible mark on Viking society. They were not just property, they were the mothers, daughters, and sisters whose bloodlines shaped the Viking world. Their lives, though often erased from history, continue to live on in the genetic makeup of modern populations. The Vikings may have built an empire, but it was an empire sustained by the forced labor of women. These women were not just tools for the Viking economy, they were the heart of the empire, without whom Viking society could not have functioned. Their labor, their suffering, and their resilience were the foundation upon which the Vikings built their success. And it is time we recognize that. As we look back on the Viking era, we must acknowledge the full scope of their expansion. It was not just about battles won or land conquered, it was about the systematic exploitation of women. These women were not just captured, they were commodified. Their lives were reduced to property, their bodies used to fuel the Viking economy. But they resisted, they survived. They fought to preserve their identities, their cultures, and their humanity. We must remember these women not just as victims of Viking conquest, but as integral parts of Viking history. They were the laborers who made Viking expansion possible, the mothers who ensured the continuation of the empire, and the survivors who fought to preserve what was theirs. Their suffering is a central part of Viking history, and it's time we acknowledge that. In the end, the Vikings' success was not just due to their warriors' strength, it was due to the women they enslaved, exploited, and erased from history. The wealth that fueled their conquests, the power that allowed them to expand, and the empire that grew from their raids all rested on the backs of these women. And now, as we look back at Viking history, we must recognize that these women's lives, their suffering, and their resistance were integral to the creation of the Viking Empire. By remembering them, we honor their legacy and ensure that their stories are not forgotten. The Viking Empire was not just built on war, it was built on the suffering of enslaved women. Their labor, their resilience, and their humanity were the true foundation of Viking success. The Viking legacy, often celebrated for its warriors, exploration, and conquest, is incomplete without recognizing the hidden cost that made it all possible: the systematic exploitation and subjugation of women. While we admire the warriors who sailed across the seas and raided villages, we rarely acknowledge the essential role that enslaved women played in sustaining the Viking Empire. These women were not just victims, they were the silent architects of Viking success, and their stories have been tragically overlooked for far too long. The Vikings were skilled conquerors, but their empire was not just built on land or treasure, it was built on human lives. Capturing women during their raids was an integral part of their strategy. And these women were commodified in ways that are difficult to comprehend today. They were categorized, traded, and sold based on their perceived value, whether for labor, reproduction, or physical beauty. These women were the backbone of Viking society, serving as laborers, breeders, and for those deemed beautiful enough, as prized commodities in distant slave markets. Their value was not determined by their humanity, but by their utility to the empire. At the heart of the Viking economy was slavery, and at the heart of Viking slavery were the women who were taken from villages, forced to work, and stripped of their rights. Their roles went far beyond simple servitude. The Vikings needed women not only for their labor, but also for their ability to bear children who would inherit the status of slavery and perpetuate the system for generations. This complex system of exploitation ensured that the Vikings had a never-mind-ascending supply of slaves, fueling their empire's expansion. Despite the horrific system that sought to erase their identities, these women found ways to resist. They fought back even when escape seemed impossible. And though their resistance was often small and fleeting, it was a powerful assertion of their humanity. Whether through subtle acts of sabotage, cultural preservation, or outright defiance, these women refused to be completely broken by their circumstances. They continued to teach their children their languages, pass down stories from their homelands, and preserve their traditions in secret. In doing so, they defied the system that sought to erase their identities and cultures. Their resistance, however quiet or brief, was a testament to their strength. They were not just passive victims, they were active agents in their own survival, and their stories deserve to be remembered. The Vikings may have erased them from history, but their resilience is woven into the fabric of the Viking Empire. The wealth, power, and expansion that defined the Vikings' success were directly tied to the bodies and suffering of these women. Modern research, including DNA analysis, has begun to uncover the hidden legacy of these women. The genetic traces left behind by enslaved women can still be found in the populations of Northern Europe. For example, the genetic makeup of Icelandic people reveals a strong Celtic influence, pointing to the large number of women from Ireland and Scotland who were captured during Viking raids and trafficked into Viking settlements. These women's bloodlines, though erased from written history, continue to live on today. This genetic evidence serves as a powerful reminder that the Vikings' empire was built not just through their military conquests, but on the backs of enslaved women. These women were not just casualties of war, they were integral to the Vikings' economy and social structure. Their labor, their reproductive capacity, and their resistance were essential to the empire's survival and growth. They were the foundation upon which the Vikings built their power, yet their stories have been silenced for centuries. By acknowledging the role of these women, we can begin to understand the true cost of Viking expansion. The wealth and success of the Vikings were not simply the result of their battles and conquests, they were the result of a system that relied on the forced labor of women. These women were central to the Vikings' ability to raid, conquer, and expand. Without them, the Viking Empire would not have been able to grow or thrive. The labor they provided in the fields, in the homes, and in the production of the next generation of slaves was critical to the Vikings' success. These women deserve recognition not just as victims, but as survivors. They were not just passive objects in the Viking system, they were active participants, resisting in small, quiet ways, and preserving their cultures even under the most brutal conditions. It is time we honor their memory and acknowledge the central role they played in the Viking Empire. Without their suffering, there would have been no Viking success. As we continue to uncover the stories of these forgotten women, we must remember that their suffering was not in vain. They fought for survival, and in doing so, they preserved their humanity. It is time we recognize that the Vikings' glory was built on the labor, pain, and resilience of these women. Their stories are part of Viking history, and it's time we bring them to light. The Vikings were conquerors, but their empire was not just built on warriors, it was built on the suffering and resilience of enslaved women. We must stop glorifying the Vikings' conquests without acknowledging the deep cost at which that success came. By remembering these women and the immense suffering they endured, we can better understand the true nature of Viking expansion. These women deserve more than silence, they deserve recognition for the pivotal role they played in the Viking Age. As we approach the final chapter of this untold history, it is crucial to reflect on the broader implications of what we've uncovered. The Viking Empire, celebrated for its daring exploits and mighty warriors, was also, at its core, an empire built on human suffering, specifically the suffering of women whose lives were used as tools for the Vikings' wealth and power. Their stories may have been lost to time, their names erased from the official accounts, but their contributions were essential in shaping the Viking world as we know it today. The truth is that these women were not just captured, they were systematically exploited, commodified, and forgotten. Their bodies, their labor, their reproductive power were vital to the Viking way of life. The Vikings understood that the wealth of their empire would not be sustained through raiding alone, it required a continuous, self-perpetuating system of exploitation. This system was embodied in the enslaved women who were taken during raids, sold in slave markets, and forced to work the fields, serve in homes, and bear children who would continue the cycle of slavery. We can no longer afford to ignore this uncomfortable truth. The Vikings' success was not solely due to their military prowess, it was built on the backs of enslaved women. These women were the silent workers behind the Viking Empire, providing the labor that fueled its expansion, and ensuring its survival by giving birth to future generations of slaves. Their suffering was the hidden foundation upon which Viking society was built. As we acknowledge this hidden history, we also recognize the resilience of these women. Even in the most brutal circumstances, they fought to preserve their humanity. Through small acts of defiance, through the preservation of their culture and language, these women resisted the systems that sought to erase them. They were not passive victims, they were survivors. They fought for their dignity, for their identity, and for their place in a world that refused to see them as anything other than property. By acknowledging their suffering, we do more than honor their memory, we also expose the full scope of Viking history. The Vikings' raids and conquests are often glorified, but we must remember that the wealth and power that funded those raids came at a devastating cost. The labor of enslaved women was the fuel for the Viking machine, and without it their empire would not have thrived. The Vikings were conquerors, but their empire was built on the exploitation of human lives. Today, we have the opportunity to rewrite the narrative of Viking history. We can no longer celebrate their achievements without recognizing the deep injustices that allowed those achievements to occur. We must remember the women whose bodies were commodified, whose labor was stolen, and whose suffering built the Viking Empire. Their stories may never be fully recovered, but by acknowledging their role, we can begin to give them the recognition they have long been denied. The legacy of these women is not just one of suffering, it is one of survival and resistance. Their strength in the face of unimaginable cruelty is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It is time we recognize the essential role they played in Viking history and ensure that their suffering is not erased, but remembered as a central part of the Viking legacy. In the end, the Vikings' empire was not just built on war, exploration, and conquest, it was built on the backs of women whose lives were stolen, whose bodies were commodified, and whose suffering powered the Viking machine. These women, though largely forgotten by history, were the true foundation of Viking success. By remembering them, we honor their legacy and ensure that their stories are told for generations to come.